Story 1. The Discarded Backpack. I've always been a creature of habit. My weekdays were a blur of work emails, quick lunches at my desk, and the occasional happy hour with coworkers. Saturdays, though, were sacred. My morning jog at the park was my little escape from the chaos. This happened about a year ago during one of those jogs. It was early spring, and the air still carried a chill that stung my cheeks. The park was quiet that morning, just the way I liked it. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of my sneakers on the gravel path and the occasional chirp of birds waking up. I remember everything about that day so vividly, and I wish I didn't. About halfway through my usual route, I noticed a backpack lying in the grass just off the trail. It was black and worn, with one of those frayed straps that looked like it could snap at any moment. I don't know why I stopped. Something about the way it was sitting there felt off, like it hadn't been forgotten by accident. It wasn't zipped all the way, and I could see a corner of something sticking out. I glanced around, but there was no one nearby. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer, crouching down to take a look inside. At first, it seemed ordinary. There was a crumpled t-shirt that looked like it belonged to a child, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich wrapped in foil, and a disposable camera. The kind you'd buy at a gas station for a road trip. Felt weird but not alarming. I figured some family had a picnic and a kid left their bag behind. I decided to leave the bag where it was. Maybe whoever lost it would come back for it. Still, something about it nagged at me as I jogged away. The sandwich looked fresh, like it hadn't been sitting there for long, and the shirt had a faint smell of detergent, almost as if it had been freshly washed. I told myself I was overthinking it. People leave stuff behind all the time, right? By the time I finished my jog and headed home, I'd nearly forgotten about it. But that night, as I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, the backpack crept back into my thoughts. Something about that camera. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. The next morning started like any other. I was sipping coffee in my small kitchen, flipping through emails on my laptop. Then I heard it, a soft thud on the porch. At first I thought it was just the mail carrier, but when I went to check, I froze. There it was. The same backpack sitting on my welcome mat. My heart skipped a beat. I knew it was the same one. I recognized the frayed strap and the little tear on the side. This time it was zipped shut. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the weight of it heavier than I remembered. I hesitated, standing there in my doorway, debating whether to open it. Against my better judgment, I did. Inside, the contents had changed. The t-shirt and sandwich were gone, replaced by items that felt unsettlingly personal. There was a single photograph, slightly bent at the edges. When I picked it up, my stomach twisted. It was a picture of my house. The angle suggested it had been taken from the sidewalk just in front of my porch. My car was in the driveway and the porch light was on, which meant it had been taken recently, maybe last night. There was also a small, cheap keychain with a cartoon bear on it and a crumpled piece of paper. The paper was blank except for a greasy fingerprint in the corner. I couldn't make sense of it. Who would do this? And why? I stepped back into my house, locking the door behind me. My mind raced as I stared at the backpack sitting on my kitchen counter. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone left a backpack on my porch? They'd probably think it was a prank or that I was overreacting. I spent the rest of the day trying to go about my usual routine, but the unease never left me. Every creak of the house, every shadow outside the window made me jump. I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph. Someone had been outside my house, close enough to take a picture. The thought made my skin crawl. That night I barely slept. I kept imagining someone standing outside my window watching me, waiting. Every time I thought I heard a sound, a branch tapping against the glass or the groan of the floorboards, I would sit up in bed, my heart racing. Around 3 a.m. I finally got up and checked every lock in the house. The backpack was still on the kitchen counter, untouched. I didn't know what to do with it. Throwing it away felt wrong, almost like it might provoke whoever had left it. But keeping it felt worse, like I was inviting something terrible into my home. The next morning, I made up my mind to get rid of it. I grabbed the backpack, stuffed it into a garbage bag, and drove out to a dumpster behind an old strip mall a few miles away. I figured that would be the end of it, but when I came back home, there it was again, sitting on my porch like it had never left. My blood ran cold. This time there was a new item inside, a small child's drawing on lined paper. It showed a stick figure standing in front of what looked like my house. The figure's face was blank, just a circle with no features. Beneath the drawing, in a shaky scrawl, were the words, "Come outside." I stood there on the porch, the drawing in my hand, feeling the weight of the words sink into my chest. Come outside. It wasn't just creepy, it felt like a command. I scanned the street, but it was empty. No cars, no neighbors walking their dogs, just an eerie silence hanging in the air. The thought of someone lurking nearby made me feel exposed. I slammed the door shut and locked it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped the drawing on the floor. I decided then and there to call the police. This was no longer just a prank, it felt like a threat. When the officer arrived, I explained everything, the backpack, the photo, the drawing. He looked skeptical at first, but when I showed him the items, his expression changed. He examined the photograph closely, his brow furrowed. "You said this was left on your porch?" he asked. I nodded. He walked out to check the front yard while I stood in the doorway trying to steady my nerves. After a few minutes, he came back, shaking his head. "There's no sign of anyone around. I'll file a report, but I'd recommend keeping your doors locked and maybe installing some cameras." That was it. He left and I was alone again, more unsettled than ever. After the officer left, I sat on the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Cameras, that was a good idea. I ordered a set online immediately, but they wouldn't arrive for a few days. Until then, I was on my own. Every noise outside felt amplified, every shadow stretching across my walls felt alive. I kept the backpack in the corner of the living room, too afraid to touch it again. The drawing, though, stayed with me. I kept staring at it, trying to figure out why it felt so disturbingly familiar. It wasn't just the house in the picture, it was something about the blank face. It felt personal, like whoever had drawn it knew me. That night, I barely moved from the couch. I left the lights on in every room and kept my phone fully charged in case I needed to call for help. Around midnight, I heard something, soft footsteps just outside my front door. My heart pounded as I crept to the window and peeked through the blinds. There was nothing there, just the empty porch and the dim glow of the streetlights. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. But the footsteps never returned, and eventually I convinced myself that I'd imagined them. I was just on edge, right? At least that's what I told myself. The next morning, I woke up on the couch with a stiff neck and an uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The living room was quiet, too quiet. As I sat up, I noticed the backpack wasn't in the corner where I'd left it. My stomach sank. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow and crevice, but it was gone. My heart raced as I tried to figure out what to do. Did someone come inside while I was asleep? I checked all the doors and windows, but they were still locked. That didn't make sense. I even checked the trash cans, thinking maybe I'd thrown it out in some kind of sleep-deprived haze. Nothing. It was like the backpack had just vanished. I thought I'd finally lost my mind until I opened the front door. There it was again, sitting neatly on the porch as if mocking me. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed it, marched out to my car, and drove straight to the nearest police station. The officer at the desk didn't look thrilled to see me, but I insisted they take it. "Someone's stalking me," I said, pushing the backpack toward him. He sighed, opened it, and looked through the contents. His face shifted as he pulled out another photograph, this one of me. I was sitting on my couch, staring at the drawing. The angle was unmistakable. The photo had been taken from inside my house. The officer's face hardened as he stared at the photograph. He asked me to wait in the lobby while he spoke to someone in the back. I sat there, my legs bouncing nervously, glancing around at the sterile, fluorescent-lit room. It felt surreal, like I was in a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. A part of me wanted to bolt out the door and never look back, but the thought of going home alone was even worse. After what felt like an eternity, the officer came back with a detective. They asked me more questions. If I'd seen anyone, heard anything unusual, or had any enemies. I told them everything, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. "We'll look into it," the detective said, but it didn't feel reassuring. They kept the backpack as evidence, but as I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. When I got back to my house, the atmosphere felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. I triple-checked the locks and tried to distract myself with TV, but nothing worked. Around midnight, as I was about to head to bed, I noticed something outside the window. A small flash of light, like the reflection of a camera lens. My chest tightened and I froze, unsure of what to do. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the light was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife and waiting for morning to come. The cameras I ordered arrived the next day and I installed them immediately. For weeks after that, I didn't see or hear anything unusual, but the fear never left me. To this day, I don't know who left the backpack or why they targeted me. But every time I hear a noise outside, I can't help but wonder, are they still watching? Story 2. The Night Shift Passenger. I've been driving for a rideshare company for about 2 years now, mostly doing night shifts because the tips tend to be better and the roads are quieter. This happened about 8 months ago during one of those long, uneventful Thursday nights. I was in my late 20s, juggling bills and a full-time college schedule during the day, so driving at night was my way to stay afloat. That night started like any other. I grabbed a large coffee, cranked up a playlist to keep me awake, and waited for pings. Around 1:30 a.m., just as I was thinking about calling it a night, I got a request from a user with no profile picture and the name Jay. The pickup was only a few blocks away, so I accepted without hesitation. When I pulled up to the location, I couldn't see anyone at first. The street was poorly lit, lined with those old duplexes where the paint always seems to be peeling off. A tall figure stepped out of the shadows just as I was about to cancel the ride. He looked average, I guess, except for how rigidly he moved, like every step was calculated. He wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face, but I caught a glimpse of pale skin and a jawline that seemed almost too sharp. He didn't say anything as he opened the back door and slid in, sitting directly behind me instead of diagonally, which most passengers do. "Good evening," I offered, glancing at him through the rearview mirror, but he didn't respond. Instead, he typed the destination into the app, a location on the outskirts of town. I started driving, and the silence in the car was immediate and thick, like a heavy blanket draped over us. Normally, I'd try to strike up a conversation, but something about this guy told me he wasn't in the mood for small talk. Instead, I focused on the GPS and the road ahead. The destination was about 20 minutes away, and the route led out of the city and into the outskirts, where the streets became less familiar and streetlights grew sparse. I couldn't help glancing at him occasionally in the rearview mirror. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his face partially obscured by the hood. I noticed his hands, pale, long fingers resting on his lap, and how they twitched every so often, like he was tapping out some rhythm only he could hear. About 10 minutes into the ride, just as we were leaving the last well-lit stretch of road, he finally spoke. His voice was low and flat, the kind that you have to strain to hear. "I've been here before," he said, almost to himself. I frowned, unsure if he was talking to me or not. "But not with you." That phrase sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was talking about the area, I reasoned. I forced a chuckle, trying to lighten the mood. "Small world, huh?" He didn't respond. Instead, he shifted slightly in his seat, and I felt his gaze through the mirror, sharp and unblinking. My grip tightened on the wheel. Something wasn't right. The GPS guided us onto a narrow, winding road surrounded by dense trees. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and the further we went, the more isolated it felt. Houses became fewer and farther apart until there were none at all. It was just the road, the forest, and this unnerving passenger. The tension in the car was almost palpable. I turned up the music slightly, hoping it would drown out the silence, but the move felt pathetic, like putting a band-aid on a gaping wound. That's when I noticed the address. It didn't have a street number, just a name, Red Ridge. No one lived in places like this, at least no one normal. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual. So, do you come out here often? My voice cracked slightly, betraying my unease. Again, no answer. He didn't even acknowledge that I had spoken. Instead, he tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. My stomach churned. Every instinct told me to turn around, cancel the ride, and leave him stranded, but I was too far in now. My mind raced with excuses I could give to cut the trip short, but before I could muster the courage, he leaned forward slightly and whispered, "It's different this time." The words sent an icy jolt through me. Different how? What did he mean? I didn't dare ask. We finally reached the destination, or what was supposed to be the destination. The GPS announced, "You have arrived," but all I could see was an overgrown lot. The headlights illuminated a crumbling structure, barely recognizable as a house. The roof sagged in the middle and the windows were gaping black holes. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I stopped the car but kept the engine running, suddenly hyper-aware of the eerie stillness outside. Crickets should have been chirping, or at least the sound of wind rustling through the trees, but there was nothing. Just silence. "This is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. My passenger didn't reply. He just sat there, staring at the ruins, his pale hands now gripping the edge of his seat. I glanced back at him, my nerves fraying with each passing second. "Hey, I think there's a mistake. No one lives here." He finally moved, leaning forward enough that I could feel his breath on the back of my neck. "It's not a mistake," he said, his voice softer now but no less unsettling. He gestured toward the house with a slow, deliberate motion. "You don't have to come. I'll go alone." Every fiber of my being screamed at me to drive off, but I was frozen in place. Something about his tone, his presence held me captive. Then, without another word, he opened the door and stepped out, leaving it slightly ajar as he headed toward the house. I sat there gripping the wheel, debating what to do. Every instinct told me to drive off, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He walked with that same rigid, mechanical stride, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the decrepit house. The door hung loosely on its hinges, creaking as he pushed it open. My headlights cast just enough light to see him step inside, but the darkness swallowed him almost immediately. I checked the time on my phone, 2:13 a.m., and then noticed something strange. The app didn't mark the ride as complete. Normally, as soon as a passenger reaches their destination, the trip ends automatically, but this one was still active. My heart thumped harder as I refreshed the screen, but it stayed the same. It was like the system didn't recognize that we'd arrived. Minutes passed and he didn't come back out. The air in the car felt suffocating, like it was pressing down on me. I told myself I'd give him 5 minutes and then leave, but a morbid curiosity rooted me in place. What could he possibly be doing in there? The house didn't look livable. Hell, it barely looked safe to stand in. I leaned over the console to peer through the passenger window, hoping to catch some sign of movement. That's when I saw it. A faint flicker of light, like the glow of a candle, appeared in one of the upstairs windows. My breath caught in my throat. There was no way that place had power, and he hadn't been carrying anything when he got out. My hands trembled as I considered my next move. Against my better judgment, I turned off the car and stepped outside. The night air was cold and sharp, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and decay. I told myself I just wanted to make sure he was okay, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. I needed to know what was happening in that house. My footsteps crunched on the gravel driveway as I approached the front door, which was still slightly ajar. I hesitated, listening for any sounds from inside. Nothing. Just that suffocating silence, broken only by the distant hum of insects. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky and quieter than I intended. No response. The candlelight upstairs flickered again, casting warped shadows across the cracked walls. I pushed the door open, and it groaned on its rusted hinges. The interior was even worse than I imagined. The floorboards were warped and covered in a thick layer of dust, and the air felt damp and heavy, like the place was holding its breath. My flashlight app barely cut through the darkness, illuminating splintered furniture and graffiti scrawled across the walls. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out again, stepping further inside. My voice echoed unnaturally, like the house swallowed it whole. I paused at the base of the staircase, staring up at where the light had been. My gut told me to turn back, but something compelled me to climb. As I placed my foot on the first step, a creak echoed through the house, and for a brief second, I thought I heard faint whispers coming from above. Each step I took up the staircase felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The creaking wood beneath my feet seemed impossibly loud, a sharp contrast to the eerie quiet that filled the rest of the house. As I reached the top, the candlelight flickered again, leading me to a door slightly ajar at the end of the hallway. The walls here were lined with peeling wallpaper, revealing jagged scars of wood beneath, and the air carried a sour, metallic smell that turned my stomach. My heart pounded as I moved closer to the door, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I thought about calling out again, but my voice caught in my throat. There was something profoundly wrong about this place. I stopped just outside the door, my breathing shallow. The flickering light from inside cast long, jittery shadows onto the hallway, dancing as though they had a life of their own. Slowly, I pushed the door open with my foot. The room inside was almost empty, except for a single wooden chair in the center, its back facing me. On the chair sat the candle, its wax melting onto the wood. But there was no sign of him. Where did he go? I whispered to myself, the sound barely audible over my thundering pulse. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a set of footprints in the dust on the floor. They led into the room but didn't lead back out. It was as if he had vanished. I stood there, frozen, staring at the footprints as my mind raced. The candle's flicker seemed to grow erratic, throwing strange, distorted shapes across the walls. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but it wasn't from the cold, it was the oppressive feeling of being watched. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to leave, but my legs refused to move. Slowly, I took a step into the room, following the trail of footprints. They ended just a few feet away from the chair, abruptly stopping in the middle of the room. My heart sank as I tried to make sense of it. I turned in a slow circle, sweeping the flashlight around the room. That's when I heard it, a faint creak like a weight shifting on the floorboards behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly, but the doorway was empty. My throat tightened and I forced out a shaky breath. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. The silence that followed was unbearable. I backed away, keeping my flashlight trained on the door, and bumped into the chair. The impact sent the candle toppling to the floor, plunging the room into near darkness. In the faint glow of my flashlight, I saw something that made my heart stop. Another set of footprints, smaller this time, appearing in the dust just outside the doorway. They moved slowly, deliberately, heading toward me. I stumbled backward, the beam of light shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. No one was there, but the footprints kept coming. My hands were trembling so badly that the flashlight barely stayed steady. The footprints stopped just a few feet in front of me, as though whoever, or whatever, was making them had decided to pause. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears and my breath came in. Shallow, panicked gasps. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my body was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a mix of fear and disbelief. "I need to get out of here," I muttered to myself, forcing my legs to move. As I turned to bolt down the hallway, a low, guttural whisper filled the air, sending shivers through every inch of me. It wasn't words exactly, more like a sound that suggested words, as if spoken just on the edge of understanding. The whisper grew louder, overlapping itself, filling the space around me like an invisible tide. I sprinted for the stairs, the sound following me, rising in intensity. My feet barely touched the steps as I hurtled downward, gripping the banister to keep from falling. The house seemed to groan around me, the walls creaking as if they were alive. When I reached the front door, I didn't bother looking back. I flung it open and stumbled into the night, gasping for the cold, fresh air. My car was just a few feet away, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as though dozens of unseen eyes were boring into my back, urging me to leave but daring me to turn around. I didn't. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and locked it in one frantic motion. I fumbled with the ignition, my hands shaking so badly that it took 3 tries to get the engine to start. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the dilapidated house one last time. That's when I saw it. Standing in the doorway was the passenger, his hood pulled back to reveal a face that didn't look quite human. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, they were dark, endless voids, like they were absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He didn't move, just stood there staring at me, his head tilted slightly as if curious. My chest tightened, and I slammed the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed onto the narrow road. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him still standing there. But the doorway was empty. My phone buzzed suddenly in the cup holder, making me jump. I snatched it up, hoping it was the rideshare app confirming the trip was over, but the screen showed an error message. Destination not recognized. Please try again. My blood ran cold. I tossed the phone aside and focused on the road, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that he wasn't done with me. Sometimes, late at night, I'll get a notification for a new ride request with no profile picture and the name EJ. I don't accept them anymore. I don't even drive at night. But I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before he finds me again. Story 3. The Silent Guest. When my boyfriend Alex and I moved into our first apartment, we were thrilled. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of an old building in a quiet neighborhood, but it was ours. We'd spent weeks scouring second-hand stores for furniture and decorating the place with little knickknacks that made it feel like home. Life at the time was simple. We were both juggling early career jobs, excited to come home and cook dinner together, watch TV, and just enjoy the small freedom of living on our own. But after a few weeks, little things started to feel off. It began subtly, almost too subtle to notice. I'd come home after work and find the throw blanket on the couch folded differently than I remembered. Alex swore he hadn't touched it. A mug I always left on the counter would sometimes be in the sink. At first we laughed it off. Maybe the place is haunted, Alex joked. But the strange details piled up. One evening, I opened the fridge and noticed half a container of leftover pasta was missing. "Did you eat this for lunch?" I asked Alex. He shook his head, but we didn't think much of it. Maybe I was imagining things. But then came the cologne. A faint but distinct smell would linger in the apartment when we got home from work, a smell neither of us used. That was when the unease started to creep in. We finally decided to mention it to our landlord, Mr. Rains, an older man who lived on the ground floor. He was the type who'd always tell you how things were back in his day and seemed more interested in collecting rent than addressing concerns. When I brought up the smell of cologne and the missing food, he chuckled dismissively. "You two are probably just forgetting stuff," he said. "Happens all the time with young couples like yourselves." I didn't push further, but I left the conversation feeling frustrated and a little embarrassed, like I'd overreacted. Alex, always the rational one, suggested we let it go and just pay closer attention to things. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The turning point came one Saturday morning. I was cleaning while Alex was out running errands. As I moved the couch to vacuum underneath, I noticed something weird, a thin metallic scratch on the floorboards near the far corner. It wasn't from our furniture and it hadn't been there before. I crouched down to inspect it and realized it wasn't just a scratch. It was directly under a square outline in the ceiling. I stood on the couch to get a better look and spotted what appeared to be a small hatch, blending almost seamlessly into the painted surface. My stomach dropped. I had never noticed it before, and when Alex got home, he hadn't either. It wasn't just part of the apartment's charm. This thing was deliberately concealed. We couldn't ignore the hatch. It felt like a crack in the illusion of safety we had built around ourselves in that apartment. "Do you think it leads to the attic?" I asked Alex. He stood there staring at it, his jaw tight. "Maybe," he said, but I could tell he was uneasy. That night, neither of us slept well. Every creak of the old building felt amplified, like it was coming from above us. The idea of anyone, having access to a space we didn't know existed made my skin crawl. But Alex was practical, and the next morning, he borrowed a ladder from Mr. Raines under the pretense of needing to check a light fixture. When Alex climbed up, I held my breath. He pressed his hand against the edge of the hatch and pushed. It opened easily, the paint cracking slightly where it had been sealed. A wave of cold air rushed out, carrying a faint but unmistakable scent, cologne. My heart raced as Alex shone his flashlight into the darkness above. "It's empty," he said, though his voice sounded uncertain. I climbed up after him, peering into the narrow space. It wasn't much of an attic, more like a crawl space that extended over the neighboring apartments. But then I saw it, a crumpled blanket, a dented soda can, and, most disturbingly, a pair of scuffed shoes. Someone had been living up there. The discovery left us shaken. We climbed down quickly, closing the hatch as if shutting it could erase what we had just seen. "What do we do?" I asked Alex, my voice trembling. He paced the room, running his hands through his hair. "We have to tell Raines," he finally said, though neither of us believed the landlord would take us seriously. Sure enough, when we knocked on his door and explained what we'd found, he waved it off like we were overreacting. "Probably just some old stuff left behind from previous tenants," he said. "Nobody's getting into your place. The building's secure." I wanted to scream at him, but Alex pulled me away, muttering under his breath, "We'll handle it ourselves." That night we couldn't relax. Every noise felt sinister, every shadow in the corners seemed darker. Around midnight, Alex decided to prop a chair under the hatch to keep it shut. It was a small act, but it made me feel a bit safer. We went to bed, though I doubt either of us really slept. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a dull thud. My heart pounded as I turned to Alex, who was already sitting up, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, too scared to speak. Then we heard it again, another thud, followed by the sound of something scraping. It was coming from above us. We sat frozen in the dark, straining to hear every sound. The scraping noise grew louder, and then it stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like the air in the room had thickened. Alex grabbed his phone and whispered, "I'm calling the police." I nodded, gripping the blanket tightly as though it could shield me from whatever was up there. As Alex spoke to the dispatcher, I couldn't take my eyes off the hatch. My mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Was it an intruder? Had someone been living above us this whole time? The dispatcher assured us officers were on their way, but those few minutes felt like hours. When the police arrived, they wasted no time. 2 officers climbed up to the hatch with flashlights and inspected the crawlspace. Alex and I stood in the hallway, clutching each other, as we waited for them to return. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers climbed back down, holding something in his hand. A worn notebook. "There's evidence someone's been staying up there," he said, flipping through the pages. Notes, dates, even some sketches. My stomach turned. "Were they here?" Alex asked. The officer shook his head. "The space is empty now, but it looks like they've been coming and going for a while." The notebook was chilling. The officer let us skim through it while they continued to search the attic. Each page was filled with frantic handwriting, listing times of day and cryptic notes like "quiet today" or "watch TV." One entry even mentioned Alex by name. The tall one leaves at 8 o'clock. My breath caught in my throat. They had been observing us, our routines, our habits. There were crude sketches too, including one of our living room with our couch, table, and even my favorite blanket. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever had been up there wasn't just hiding. They had been watching us. The officers finished their search but found no sign of anyone. They told us the crawlspace extended across multiple units and could only be accessed from the hatch in our apartment. It's possible they were using another way in before sealing themselves off here, one of them suggested, though it was little comfort. They promised to file a report and recommended that we notify the landlord to secure the hatch properly. That night Alex and I slept in a hotel. Neither of us could bear the thought of staying in that apartment, knowing how easily someone had invaded our lives without us even realizing it. The next day we returned to the apartment to pack up some essentials. Daylight softened the fear a little, but every creak in the floorboards still set me on edge. Alex insisted on reinforcing the hatch before we spent even a second more inside. He used screws and a metal latch from the hardware store, making it impossible to open without tools. Even so, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. As I stood in the kitchen, I noticed something small but terrifying, a half-empty soda can on the counter. Alex didn't drink soda and I hadn't brought any home. It hadn't been there the night before. That was the final straw. We packed our things and left that same evening, calling Mr. Rains on the way out to let him know we wouldn't be renewing the lease. He tried to convince us it was all just paranoia, but I didn't care anymore. We moved into a new place across town within a week, and though the fear slowly faded, I still find myself glancing at ceilings in every new apartment I visit. I wonder sometimes if the person in the crawlspace ever realized we were gone, or if they found someone new to watch. Story 4. The Persistent Salesman. I live alone in a modest house at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, surrounded by neighbors I barely know beyond the occasional wave. This happened about 3 years ago during one of those muggy spring seasons where the air feels heavy and everything seems to echo louder than it should. At the time, I worked from home as a freelance editor, which meant I spent most of my days in solitude, absorbed in books and emails. My life was pretty uneventful. Morning coffee, a few hours of editing, a walk around the block to clear my head, and then dinner with a Netflix binge before bed. That's why I was surprised one afternoon when I heard a sharp knock at the door. It startled me enough that I spilled my tea, the noise cutting through the otherwise silent house like a slap. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a man in his mid-30s wearing a crumpled gray suit. He had an overly friendly smile and a clipboard that he clutched like it held the secrets of the universe. "Good afternoon. I'm Sam from Neighborhood Solutions," he said, his voice overly chipper. "I've got an incredible offer for you today." I wasn't in the mood for sales pitches, but before I could politely decline, he leaned in slightly and added, "I noticed your garden needs some care. Our landscaping packages are perfect for someone like you." The way he said it felt off, like he'd been watching me. My front yard was a mess, sure, but it wasn't visible from the street and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. I forced a smile and said, "No, thank you," before shutting the door. But as I walked back to my desk, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes lingering on me, even with the door closed. The next day around the same time, the same sharp knock came again. I froze for a moment, then peeked through the peephole. Sure enough, it was Sam, the salesman in the crumpled suit. This time, he was holding a laminated brochure and wearing an even broader smile. I hesitated but eventually opened the door a crack. "Hi again," he said enthusiastically as if we were old friends. "I know you're busy, but I couldn't stop thinking about how much our services could help you. I mean, with your schedule and everything, wouldn't it be nice to have one less thing to worry about?" My schedule? I hadn't mentioned anything about my work or lifestyle. I stared at him, my unease growing. "No, really, I'm fine," I said firmly and closed the door again. This time, I watched through the blinds as he walked away, slowly, like he was waiting for me to call him back. By the third day, I was dreading the knock, and when it came, it was louder, more insistent. I decided to ignore it, hoping he'd go away. But he didn't. He knocked for what felt like an eternity, and then I heard a faint rustling sound, like someone brushing against the bushes near my window. My heart pounded as I crept to the window, staying low. I peeked out and saw him standing there, just outside the line of sight of the front door, looking at his clipboard and muttering to himself. My stomach twisted. Why was he so determined? I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, but before I could dial, he walked away, his steps unhurried, as though he'd achieved something I wasn't aware of. For a few days, I didn't see him, and I started to relax, convincing myself it had just been an overly persistent salesman. But that sense of peace didn't last. One evening, as I was pulling into my driveway after running errands, I saw him again. He wasn't on my porch this time. He was standing at the far end of the street, near the lamppost, staring in my direction. My stomach dropped, and I fumbled to grab my keys as I got out of the car. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stood there, silhouetted against the dim glow of the streetlight. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me, and immediately turned off all the lights. Peeking out through the blinds, I could still see him, just standing there like he was waiting for something. That night, I barely slept. Every creak in the house made me jump. Every passing car felt like it might be him coming back. By the next morning, I was exhausted but determined to do something about it. I walked over to my neighbor's house, an older man named Harold who'd lived in the neighborhood for decades, and told him what had been happening. He frowned, his brow furrowing in concern. "That doesn't sound right," he said. "I haven't seen anyone like that around here before." Harold was the kind of guy who looked out for the people on the street, and his worry only deepened mine. He promised to keep an eye out and told me to call him if I noticed anything unusual. That gave me some comfort, but not much. 2 days later, I was home alone again, trying to distract myself with work, when I heard the knock. It was him. I didn't even need to check. Something in the rhythm of it was unmistakable. My chest tightened as I froze in my chair, praying he'd just leave. But then he spoke. "I know you're in there," he called out, his voice calm but unsettling. "I've got something for you. You're going to want to see this." My skin crawled, and I felt a wave of anger rise up through the fear. I marched to the door and yanked it open, determined to end this once and for all. "Listen, you need to leave me alone. I'm not interested, and I'm calling the police if you come back," I snapped. He didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled, wider than before, and handed me an envelope. "You'll change your mind," he said cryptically before turning and walking away, his shoes crunching loudly on the gravel. I didn't open the envelope right away. Something about it felt wrong, like whatever was inside was better left unknown. But curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a list of dates and times, appointments, meetings, and errands I had run over the past month. My entire routine, laid out in meticulous detail. My hands shook as I read it, each line a reminder that this man had been watching me for weeks, maybe longer. There was a handwritten note at the bottom. "Let me help you." I felt sick. This wasn't about selling services anymore. This was personal, and I didn't understand why. I called Harold immediately and told him everything, my voice shaking as I tried to explain the list and the note. He was over within minutes, holding a flashlight and an old baseball bat. "We're going to check the street," he said firmly, his presence steadying me just enough to think clearly. Together, we walked the length of the cul-de-sac, Harold's flashlight sweeping through the shadows between the houses. There was no sign of Sam, but the eerie stillness of the street made my skin prickle. Harold stopped near the lamppost where I'd seen Sam standing before and pointed at the ground. "Look," he said. There were cigarette butts, dozens of them, piled in a small heap. "He's been waiting here," Harold muttered, his face grim. I felt a cold dread wash over me. How long had he been watching from this exact spot? That night, Harold insisted on staying over, which I was more than grateful for. I barely slept, jumping at every sound, but Harold seemed calm, sitting in my living room with the bat resting on his lap. The next morning, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, explaining everything that had happened. The officer I spoke to took my report seriously, though he admitted there wasn't much they could do unless Sam showed up again or directly threatened me. "We'll keep an eye on the area," he said, but the words didn't reassure me. After the call, I tried to go about my day as normally as possible, but every time I passed a window, I found myself glancing outside, half expecting to see him lurking at the end of the street again. For a few days, everything was quiet. No knocks, no sightings, nothing. I started to think maybe the police presence in the area had scared him off. I even managed to sleep through the night for the first time in weeks. But on the fourth night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood run cold, a faint tapping on my bedroom window. My house is a single story, so the windows aren't high off the ground. I froze, barely daring to breathe, and listened as the tapping continued in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I reached for my phone and texted Harold. "Someone's outside my window." Seconds later, I heard his front door slam, and his voice called out into the night, "Hey, who's out there?" The tapping stopped instantly, and I heard hurried footsteps retreating down the side of the house. By the time Harold reached my yard, whoever it was had disappeared. He stayed with me until morning, pacing the living room with his bat, muttering about how he should have scared the guy off for good. When daylight finally broke, we went outside to check the area. That's when I saw it, a muddy handprint smeared across the glass of my bedroom window. The sight of it made my stomach churn. It was proof that he'd been right there, just feet away from where I'd been sleeping. Harold called the police again, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no clues, nothing except that chilling handprint. After the handprint incident, I became a prisoner in my own home. I kept all the curtains drawn, double-checked every lock, and jumped at the slightest noise. Harold stayed vigilant, coming over every evening to check on me, but even his presence couldn't erase the gnawing sense of dread. One evening, as we were sitting in the living room, there was a sudden knock at the door. Harold sprang to his feet, bat in hand, and motioned for me to stay back. He opened the door cautiously, but no one was there. Instead, there was a small package sitting on the doorstep, wrapped neatly in brown paper. Harold picked it up and handed it to me without saying a word. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing a framed photo of myself. It was a candid shot, taken from a distance, of me walking to my car, completely unaware I was being watched. That was the breaking point. I packed a bag and stayed with Harold for a few days while I figured out what to do. I reported the package to the police, who finally seemed to take the situation more seriously. They promised to increase patrols in the neighborhood and urged me to consider installing a security system. Desperate for some sense of control, I did just that. Harold helped me set up cameras around the house, each one carefully angled to cover the entire property. It didn't feel like enough, but at least I could watch the footage and know if he came back. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I might be able to reclaim some semblance of normalcy. For a week, nothing happened. The cameras didn't pick up anything unusual, and the knocks and tapping had stopped. I started to believe it was over, that maybe he'd moved on or been scared off by the police presence in the cameras. But then, late one night, my phone buzzed with a notification. One of the motion-activated cameras had picked up movement in my front yard. My heart raced as I opened the app to check the live feed. There he was, Sam, standing perfectly still just outside the glow of the porch light, staring directly into the camera. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just stood there for what felt like an eternity before finally turning and walking away. The footage chilled me to my core. He knew about the cameras and he didn't care. I saved the footage and sent it to the police, who assured me they'd escalate their investigation. But that was the last time I saw him. He never returned, and the strange occurrences stopped completely. It's been 3 years now, and I still don't know who he really was or why he targeted me. Every so often, I catch myself glancing out the window or checking the cameras, half expecting to see him standing there again. I've moved to a new city since then, trying to leave the fear behind, but some nights I still wake up to phantom sounds, tapping, footsteps, a knock at the door, and my heart races like it did back then. I'll never forget the way he looked at that camera like he wanted me to know he was always watching. Story 5. The Vanishing Dog. I've always been the kind of person who rolls their eyes at weird stories. You know the ones? Shadows in the corners, doors creaking open on their own, stuff people swear happened but never makes sense when you hear it. But last summer, something happened that changed my perspective completely. I still can't explain it, and I probably never will. At the time, I was living with my parents and younger sister in a small house on the edge of town. It was nothing fancy, just a cozy place with a big backyard that our dog, Max, absolutely loved. Max was a black and white mutt with one floppy ear and a bark that could wake the dead. He was the kind of dog who'd bark at leaves, so when he started going crazy by the back fence every night, we didn't think much of it, at first. It started subtly. Around 10 p.m. every night, Max would rush to the back fence, growling low before letting out these sharp, frantic barks. We figured it was raccoons or maybe a stray cat passing through. But after a week, the barking got more intense. He'd lunge at the fence, his hackles raised, and his growls sounded different, deeper, almost angry. My dad checked the yard a couple of times with a flashlight, but he never found anything. No raccoons, no cats, not even a rustle in the bushes. Max, though, was relentless. Every night, like clockwork, he'd bark and growl at the same spot near the back corner of the fence. It was starting to creep me out, not just because he was acting so strange, but because the spot he was focused on was completely empty. By the second week, the tension in the house was palpable. Max wasn't just barking anymore. He was scratching at the ground near the fence as if he was trying to dig his way out. My dad decided to check it out again, this time during the day. He and I went to the spot where Max was so fixated, but there was nothing unusual. Just dirt, grass, and a few weeds. Maybe he smells something buried, Dad said with a shrug, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, I stayed up to see if I could figure out what was bothering him. At exactly 10 p.m., Max bolted to the fence like usual, barking like his life depended on it. I grabbed a flashlight and peered into the darkness beyond the yard, but I didn't see anything. No animals, no movement, nothing at all. Yet Max was barking as though someone, or something, was standing right there. Then came the night he disappeared. I'd gone to bed early, hoping to get some sleep for once, but Max's barking woke me up around 10:30. This time it sounded more frantic than ever, almost like he was in pain. My sister and I ran out to the backyard calling for him, but the yard was eerily quiet. Max was gone. The gate was latched, and there were no holes under the fence where he could have escaped. We searched the entire yard, shining flashlights into every corner. That's when my sister spotted it, a small shoe covered in mud, sitting exactly where Max used to bark. It looked like it belonged to a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old. The sight of it made my stomach churn. It didn't make any sense. My sister wanted to bring it inside, but I told her not to touch it. Something about that shoe felt wrong, like it didn't belong there, or anywhere. The next morning, I woke up early and checked the backyard again, hoping Max had somehow found his way home during the night. But the yard was just as empty as it had been the night before. I couldn't stop thinking about that shoe. I went out to look at it again in the daylight, and something struck me as even stranger. There were no footprints leading up to it. The ground around it was soft from the rain earlier in the week, yet the shoe sat there, perfectly still, with no sign of how it had gotten there. My dad joked that maybe it fell from a passing bird's nest, but even he didn't seem convinced by his own words. I felt a knot tightening in my chest. Where was Max? And who, or what, left that shoe behind? Around noon, I heard scratching at the back door. I ran to open it, my heart pounding, and there was Max, wagging his tail like nothing had happened. Relief washed over me, but then I noticed something that made me freeze. Tied tightly around his neck was a piece of frayed rope, as though someone had tried to leash him. The rope was damp and muddy, and the knot looked hastily tied, like someone had done it in a rush. Max seemed fine otherwise, no injuries, no sign of distress, but the rope, it sent a chill down my spine. Who had tied it? And where had Max been all night? I called my parents over, and when they saw the rope, their faces turned pale. My dad cut it off carefully, examining it like he thought it might tell him something, but it was just a rope. Just a muddy, frayed, inexplicable rope. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept picturing Max with that rope tied around his neck and that muddy shoe lying by the fence. I decided to stay up and keep an eye on him just in case something happened again. I sat by the back door with a blanket, a flashlight, and my phone, watching Max as he lay curled up on his bed in the corner of the living room. Around 10 p.m., he suddenly lifted his head, his ears perked up, and a low growl rumbled from his throat. My stomach dropped. I got up and opened the door just a crack to peek outside. The yard was silent, but Max darted past me, barking furiously, heading straight for the same spot by the back fence. I grabbed my flashlight and followed him, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I got to the fence, Max was standing completely still, his nose pressed to the ground. His barking had stopped, replaced by a strange whimpering sound I'd never heard from him before. I pointed the flashlight at the ground and gasped. There, in the dirt where Max had been digging for weeks, was another shoe. This one was different, smaller, bright red, and soaked as if it had been in water for days. My legs felt like jelly as I bent down to look at it. Just like before, there were no footprints, no sign of how it had gotten there. Max started barking again, but this time it wasn't directed at the ground. He was barking at something above the fence, something I couldn't see. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to run, but I was frozen in place, staring into the dark woods beyond our yard. I forced myself to move, backing away slowly with Max still barking his head off. It wasn't like his usual bark. It was sharp and panicked, almost desperate. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw movement beyond the fence. Something tall, dark, and quick, like a shadow slipping between the trees. I turned and sprinted back to the house, calling for Max. He hesitated for a moment, still growling at the fence, before he finally ran after me. Once we were inside, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut, my hands trembling. Max stayed close to me, pacing back and forth, his eyes fixed on the back door. I didn't know what to do. Calling the police felt ridiculous. What would I even say? Hey, my dog found 2 creepy shoes and now he's barking at invisible things? No one would believe me. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I barely slept. Every little noise made me jump, and Max wouldn't settle down, pacing and growling intermittently. The next morning, I went back to the fence, hoping daylight would make things feel less terrifying. But when I got there, the second shoe was gone. I checked the ground thoroughly, but it was like it had never been there. No shoe, no footprints, no disturbed dirt. I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. Relief because maybe it was over, and dread because I knew deep down it wasn't. That night, I decided to set up my phone to record the backyard. If anything weird happened, I'd at least have proof. I placed it on the windowsill, pointed it toward the fence, and hit record. Then I sat by the door again, flashlight and blanket at the ready, waiting for whatever came next. At first, the night seemed quiet. Max lay by my feet, his breathing slow and steady, and I started to wonder if maybe I'd overreacted. But then, just before 10 p.m., Max's head shot up. His ears twitched and he let out a soft growl. I froze, straining my ears, and that's when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound coming from the backyard. My stomach tightened as I grabbed the flashlight and peeked out through the curtains. The yard looked empty, but Max was already at the door, whining and pawing at the wood. I decided to check the phone footage later and opened the door cautiously. Max bolted straight to the fence, growling low in his throat. I followed him slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. This time I could hear it more clearly, footsteps, light, deliberate, moving just beyond the fence. When I reached the spot where Max always barked, I shone the flashlight into the trees. For a moment I thought I saw a figure standing there, just on the edge of the light. It was small, barely the height of a child, and it didn't move. My chest tightened as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. vanished like it had never been there. Max barked furiously, but I didn't wait around to see if it came back. I grabbed him by the collar and dragged him back to the house, my heart racing. Once inside, I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. Max wouldn't stop pacing, his tail low, and I could feel the tension radiating off him. I didn't dare check the phone until morning. I was too afraid of what I might see. The next morning, with sunlight streaming through the windows, I finally worked up the courage to check the footage on my phone. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through the recording, fast-forwarding to the time when Max had started growling. At first, it was just the usual, the backyard, the fence, and the faint outline of trees in the distance. But as I watched, something caught my eye. Around the 10-minute mark, a shadow seemed to move along the edge of the fence. It was subtle, almost like a trick of the light, but then it came closer. The shape was small, like a child, and it stopped in the exact spot where Max had been barking. I leaned closer to the screen, my stomach twisting into knots. The figure stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity before slowly backing into the trees and disappearing completely. What struck me most was how unnatural it looked. The way it moved, almost gliding without a sound, sent chills down my spine. I showed the footage to my dad, but he waved it off, saying it was probably just an animal or a neighbor's kid playing around. Who lets their kid wander into someone's yard at night? I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't have an answer. That evening, I decided I couldn't just let it go. I went back to the fence, determined to find some kind of evidence. I brought a small spade and started digging where Max had been scratching all those nights. The dirt was soft, almost too easy to dig through, and after a few minutes, my spade hit something solid. I dropped to my knees and brushed away the dirt with my hands, revealing a small, rusted tin box. It looked ancient, like it had been buried there for decades. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the box as my mind raced with possibilities. It was small, about the size of a lunchbox, and the metal was corroded with patches of rust. My hands trembled as I pried it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside there was a single object, a photograph. The edges were yellowed and brittle, and the image was faded, but I could make out a young boy standing near what looked like the same fence in my backyard. He was wearing a pair of mud-covered shoes, one of which looked identical to the first shoe Max had found. My breath caught in my throat. The boy's expression was solemn, almost sad, and there was something unnerving about the way his eyes seemed to stare straight at the camera. No, at me. I quickly closed the box and took it inside, my pulse racing as I tried to make sense of what I'd found. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sit by the back door again. I left the phone recording as usual but stayed in my room, clutching the rusted tin box like it held some kind of answer. Max was restless, pacing the house and letting out the occasional low growl. Around 10 p.m., the barking started again, but this time, it was accompanied by something else, a soft knocking sound at the back door. My blood turned cold. It wasn't loud, just a faint tap tap tap, but it was deliberate. I crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my ears, and peeked through the curtains. There was no one there, just the dark expanse of the yard. But Max was at the door, his fur bristling, barking wildly as though something, or someone, was standing right in front of him. I didn't open the door. I couldn't. The knocking stopped after what felt like an eternity, and Max eventually calmed down. I stayed awake the rest of the night, jumping at every creak and whisper of the house settling. When morning finally came, I checked the recording, dreading what I might find. The video showed the backyard as usual, dimly lit by the motion-activated lights. Around 10 p.m., the shadow appeared again, moving toward the fence. It lingered there just as it had the night before, but this time it came closer, to the house. My breath hitched as I watched the shadow move to the back door. There was a pause, then the door rattled, just slightly, like someone testing the handle. I fast-forwarded, my fingers trembling, and at one point, the shadow simply vanished. No movement, no retreat, it was just gone. I deleted the video immediately. I didn't want anyone, not even myself, to see it again. After that, everything stopped. Max stopped barking at the fence. The nightly disturbances ceased. It was as if whatever had been haunting us had finally moved on, or maybe it was satisfied. I still have the tin box and the photograph, though I've never dared to open it again. Sometimes I wonder if I should have left it buried, left whatever was out there undisturbed. I've considered moving out, but something about the house feels tethered to me now, like leaving wouldn't make a difference. I can't explain what happened, and maybe I never will, but one thing is certain. I'll never look at that fence the same way again. Even now, months later, I find myself watching it from the window, waiting for something, or someone, to appear.